The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Reporters filled the back rows, microphones ready. Cameras focused on one young man sitting nervously at the defendant's table. King Harris, son of hip-hop icon T.I., had been the center of speculation for weeks. His flashy lifestyle, his brushes with controversy, his attempts to step out of his father's shadow, all of it had led to this moment. When the judge raised the gavel, the chatter stopped. Silence fell heavy as a voice echoed through the chamber. "You are hereby sentenced." The words that followed cut through King Harris like a blade. Prison, time behind bars. A future stolen by choices that could no longer be undone. For a brief second, he sat frozen, eyes wide, lips trembling, as though the world had stopped turning. Then came the collapse. His body gave out, his knees buckled, and he fell forward against the table, sliding toward the ground. Gasps filled the courtroom. His family cried out, rushing to his side. Officers stepped in, uncertain whether to help or to hold him steady. It was a shocking sight. A young man who had always carried himself with bravado, suddenly broken under the weight of justice within minutes. The scene was everywhere, on phones, on news broadcasts, on social media feeds. The fall of King Harris wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. The son of a legend had crumbled, and now the world wanted to know what had brought him here and what would come next. The story of King Harris's courtroom collapse did not begin inside the courthouse walls. It began years earlier, in the glare of a spotlight that few children could withstand. Born into the Harris family, King grew up surrounded by fame, wealth, and expectations. His father, the Grammy-winning rapper T.I., had built an empire of music, television, and business. His mother, Tiny Harris, was also a celebrated artist. Together, they had raised their children in a world where cameras were always close and public judgment was relentless. For King, this environment was both a gift and a burden. As a child, he appeared on reality television, his every move broadcast to millions. While his siblings often stayed quiet, King's personality stood out, bold, defiant, unwilling to blend into the background. He wanted to be seen, to be known on his own terms, not just as T.I.'s son. That desire, however, often came with trouble. In his teenage years, King began to clash publicly with critics, sometimes posting heated videos online, other times getting into arguments that quickly went viral. His confidence, sometimes mistaken for arrogance, made him a target for headlines. By the time he reached his late teens, King was chasing music, trying to carve a career outside his father's shadow. But with ambition came distractions. Parties, confrontations, and a hunger for recognition often overshadowed his creative work. Rumors of legal issues swirled, minor run-ins with the law, altercations that caught public attention, whispers of reckless behavior. For King, each headline seemed to push him further from his dreams and closer to notoriety. When the charges that led to his sentencing finally came down, many saw them as the culmination of years of warning signs. The prosecution painted a picture of a young man out of control, living fast and careless with the rules. Supporters, however, argued that King was misunderstood, a target of extra scrutiny because of his famous name. They pointed out that plenty of young men made mistakes, but not everyone had their errors magnified under the unblinking eye of the media. Still, when the trial began, the weight of the evidence could not be ignored. Courtroom spectators described King as restless, tapping his foot, whispering to his lawyers, glancing back at his family in the gallery. His parents were there, their faces etched with worry, their body language a mix of support and silent frustration. T.I., usually the picture of confidence, appeared subdued. Aware that his son's fate was no longer in his hands, the prosecution laid out their case in cold detail. Witnesses spoke, documents were presented, and King's own past actions became part of the narrative. The defense countered, arguing that he was young, that he had potential, that prison would crush the possibility of reform. They pleaded for leniency, stressing that rehabilitation, not punishment, was the answer. But the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier with each passing day. When closing arguments ended, all that remained was the sentence. King sat between his attorneys, shifting in his chair, his usual bravado dimmed. He had entered the trial with a smirk, even joking with reporters outside the courthouse. But now, as the judge prepared to speak, that energy vanished. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of the gavel. The words came quickly. Prison sentence. Not probation, not community service, not a fine. Prison, the exact number of years, was secondary. The shock of confinement was enough to break through his defenses. For a moment, he seemed not to breathe. His eyes flicked toward his parents, searching for strength. But what he found instead was the reflection of his own fear mirrored back at him. Then came the collapse. His shoulders sagged, his chest heaved, and his legs betrayed him. As he slid down, the courtroom erupted in chaos. His mother cried out, rushing forward before being held back by officers. T.I. pressed his hands to his head, staring down in disbelief. The judge's voice tried to restore order, but the scene was too powerful, too human to be silenced. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras snapped, and within moments, the collapse became a symbol. To some, it was a young man realizing the reality of his actions. To others, it was proof that the justice system had gone too far, breaking a spirit that could have been redirected instead of confined. No matter the perspective, the image of King Harris on the courtroom floor became the headline the world could not look away from. Outside, crowds had gathered. Some chanted in support, others jeered, insisting that justice had been served. Police formed barriers to control the surge of people as family, friends, and fans waited for updates. Social media exploded. Hashtags trended. Clips of the collapse went viral, and debates raged over what the sentence meant. Was it a lesson? A tragedy? A turning point? Inside, as King was lifted back into his chair, his face pale and eyes swollen with tears, one truth became clear. The path ahead would be nothing like the life he had known. The bravado was gone, replaced by fear, regret, and the heavy silence of a man confronting the cost of choices. In the hours after the sentencing, the footage of King Harris collapsing in court traveled faster than wildfire. Clips were replayed on television, spliced into TikTok edits, and debated endlessly on live streams. To millions watching from home, it felt like a moment ripped from a movie, the dramatic fall of a young man whose life had always been larger than life. But inside the Harris family, it was not a spectacle. It was heartbreak. T.I. and Tiny walked out of the courthouse with their heads bowed, their silence louder than any statement. Reporters shouted questions, cameras chased them down the steps, but neither parent could bring themselves to speak. Their son's collapse wasn't just physical. It was symbolic of the weight now pressing on their entire family. For years, they had fought to balance fame with parenting, spotlight with privacy, but in that instant, they were no longer celebrities. They were simply parents watching their child crumble. Inside the holding area, King sat slumped against the wall, his hands trembling. The adrenaline of the courtroom had drained from his body, leaving only exhaustion and fear. Guards offered him water, but he barely touched it. He kept repeating the same phrase under his breath. 5 years. 5 years. As though the repetition might change reality. For a boy raised in the glare of cameras, the thought of vanishing into prison walls felt like a death sentence to his identity. Death sentence to his identity. The internet's reaction was as divided as the courtroom itself. Supporters flooded timelines with sympathy, arguing that King's collapse showed he was still young, still human, still capable of redemption. Critics, however, mocked him, saying the bravado he had displayed online was gone the moment accountability arrived. Memes surfaced within hours, cruelly exaggerating his fall. It was a reminder that in the digital age, even pain can be packaged as entertainment. But beneath the noise, real questions began to surface. Could King use this as a turning point? Would prison break him completely or force him to rebuild his life? Some pointed to his father's past. T.I. himself had faced legal troubles in his youth, overcoming them to rebuild his career and become a cultural icon. Maybe, they argued, this collapse was not the end, but the beginning of a transformation. Others weren't so optimistic. They believed the sentence would harden him, strip him of innocence, and push him deeper into anger and rebellion. Erica moments from Part 1 replaced by the Harris. Family's grief now took center stage. Tiny Harris, holding back tears, whispered to a friend outside court, "He's still just a boy." That single sentence became a headline itself, debated by commentators who questioned whether fame had stunted King's maturity. Had the wealth and attention given him too much freedom too soon? Or had the constant pressure of living under his father's name driven him toward rebellion? No answer was simple. In Atlanta, vigils were quietly organized by fans who believed King had been treated unfairly. They held candles, prayed for his strength, and posted messages with hashtags calling for leniency. At the same time, others online insisted the sentence was deserved, pointing out that countless young men without famous parents had received harsher punishments for lesser offenses. To them, King's collapse was not tragedy, but justice doing its work. Back in the courthouse, the judge's words lingered. "This is not the end of your story," he had said sternly, before lowering the gavel. "But you must decide what the next chapters will be." Those words rang in King's ears as he sat in his cell that night, staring at the blank walls, feeling the silence press in. For the first time in his life, there were no cameras, no entourage, no cheering fans or critical bloggers, just solitude, broken only by his own thoughts. Family visits in the days that followed were painful. T.I. tried to project strength, telling his son that he had the blood of survivors in his veins, that he could endure this and come out stronger. Tiny wept openly, holding King's hands through the glass, begging him to stay focused, to pray, to hold on to hope. The King nodded, but his eyes betrayed him. He was scared, terrified. The collapse in court had not been just about shock. It had been the unveiling of a young man who finally understood he was no longer untouchable. Media continued to hound the family, speculating on how the sentence would affect T.I.'s legacy, how Tiny would cope, how King's siblings would handle the scrutiny. Some gossip outlets framed the collapse as weakness, while others framed it as redemption in progress. Every frame of video, every whispered word became part of the public narrative, even as the Harris family desperately tried to keep their private grief shielded. Still, amidst the noise, there was a glimmer of something else. Letters began arriving at the jail from fans, from young men who saw themselves in King's mistakes, from mothers who begged him to learn from this moment so their own sons might do the same. Those letters piled high, offering a strange mix of comfort and pressure. King was no longer just a fallen celebrity kid. He had become a symbol. Whether he wanted it or not, people were looking at him as proof that collapse could either destroy or rebuild. As the days turned into weeks, his collapse in court remained the defining image of the case. It wasn't the charges, it wasn't the gavel, it wasn't even the sentence itself. It was the sight of a young man, once brash and bold, dropping to his knees as the weight of accountability finally crushed him. That single moment was replayed, reinterpreted, and relived countless times, becoming more than just an event. It was a cautionary tale. But inside King himself, the story was still being written. His collapse had been public, his tears exposed to the world. But what would happen next? The choices he made in the silence of a cell would determine whether the fall was permanent, or whether it was the beginning of his climb back in the weeks that followed. The image of King Harris collapsing in court refused to fade. It played on television loops, appeared in online compilations, and lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it firsthand. What might have been a fleeting moment became a defining symbol. The son of a legend, humbled, broken, and facing the weight of justice, the courtroom drama quickly transformed into a national conversation. Talk shows debated endlessly whether King's sentence was fair. Some hosts argued that he had finally faced the consequences of a reckless lifestyle, while others claimed the punishment was excessive. A harsh example made of a young man because of his family's fame. The collapse itself became a metaphor, analyzed and overanalyzed, with psychologists invited to explain how stress, shock, and denial can physically overwhelm a body. On social media, the divide grew sharper. Supporters flooded timelines with messages of sympathy, sharing clips of King's music and interviews, urging people to remember he was more than a headline. Critics were less forgiving, mocking his collapse as weakness, creating memes that stripped the moment of its pain and turned it into entertainment. In the digital arena, compassion and cruelty battled for dominance, and King had no say in how he was portrayed. For T.I. and Tiny, the fallout was exhausting. Their family name had always carried weight, but now it carried a shadow. Every interview request, every paparazzi photo, every headline reminded them that their son's mistakes were public property. T.I., who had built his career on resilience and reinvention, spoke carefully when he finally addressed the issue. "My son is facing his path," he said in a somber interview. "This is his trial, but it's also his chance. We've all made mistakes. What matters is what he does with this moment." His words were measured, but the pain in his eyes was clear. Behind bars, King wrestled with realities he had never imagined. Gone were the designer clothes, the bright lights, the endless stream of attention. In their place were rigid routines, the cold clang of cell doors, and the sharp edges of a world that didn't care who his father was. For someone who had grown up constantly watched, the sudden anonymity was disorienting. Some inmates recognized him, treating him with a mix of curiosity and respect, but most saw him as just another number. Letters continued to pour in from fans, from critics, from strangers who saw him as a lesson or a warning. Some urged him to use his time to write, to reflect, to build music that carried weight. Others scolded him, demanding he own his actions and stop hiding behind his family's legacy. King read some, ignored others, but the sheer volume reminded him daily that his life was no longer just his own. In the outside world, activists began using his case to highlight larger issues. Some argued it exposed the harshness of sentencing for young offenders, while others pointed out the privileges he still had compared to those without famous parents. His collapse became part of speeches, op-eds, and debates about justice, race, and celebrity. King Harris had become more than a person. He was now a symbol, dragged into arguments far bigger than himself. Yet in the quiet moments, stripped of cameras and noise, King began to see his collapse differently. What had felt like humiliation in the courtroom slowly became a turning point in his mind. He replayed it in memory, the shock, the fall, the helplessness, and realized it was the first time he had truly faced the consequences of his choices. For once, there had been no escape, no deflection, no bravado to cover the truth. In that fall, he had hit rock bottom. And from rock bottom, there was nowhere to go but up. Family visits became lifelines. Tiny's voice carried warmth, reminding him he was still loved. I pushed him to think ahead, urging him to use his time to read, to write, to come back stronger. His siblings wrote letters, some filled with encouragement, others blunt in their disappointment. It was tough love, but it lit a spark. Slowly, King began to write thoughts, lyrics, prayers scribbled in notebooks that became his refuge. The media, of course, never stopped circling. Every rumor of a fight inside, every detail of his adjustment, every whisper became fuel for speculation. But occasionally, stories emerged of King mentoring younger inmates or organizing small circles where they shared dreams and regrets. Whether exaggerated or true, these stories offered a glimpse of transformation, painting a picture of a boy beginning to grow into a man. As months turned into years, the collapse that had once been mocked began to take on new meaning. To some, it remained a cautionary tale, proof of how quickly arrogance can crumble under pressure. To others, it became a moment of honesty, a reminder that even those who seem untouchable are still human. For King himself, it was the line that divided his past from his future. Before the collapse, he was a boy chasing attention. After it, he was someone learning to chase purpose. When the day finally comes that he walks free, the world will be waiting. Cameras will return, microphones will reach for his words, and headlines will be written before he even speaks. But King knows the story they will tell is not yet complete. His collapse was not the end. It was the beginning of a chapter still unfolding, one that only he can write. And so, the moment that shocked a courtroom and echoed across the world remains frozen in memory. King Harris, the son of hip-hop royalty, knees buckling, body falling, as the weight of a prison sentence crushed him. But history may remember it differently, not just as a fall, but as the exact moment he began to rise.